Hi, friends. Welcome to Chalice Author Conversations. I'm your host, Tracy Smith, and I am so excited to have with us today the author of Blessed Are the Women, Claire McKeever Burgett. Claire, thank you so much for talking with us today.
Thanks for having me. I'm glad to be
Oh,
here.
this is so fun. So this is kind of the beginning of our series of author chats. And so for the first one, I started this little tradition. I know it's cringe. Nobody likes to hear their own bio read, but I'm going to ask you to suffer through it so that those that maybe haven't heard of you or know about you will get a little flavor of who you are. So here's your back of the book bio. It says Claire McKeever Burgett is an author, creative, contemplative, and spiritual director who has dedicated her life to bridging spirituality and social justice. She has a background in English and professional writing from Baylor and a Master of Divinity from Vanderbilt. She served as clergy, led congregations, facilitated transformative writing, movement, and liturgical practices centered on healing and embodiment. A mother, certified birth and postpartum doula, yoga, dance, and martial arts instructor. Claire lives with her family in Nashville, Tennessee. She writes regularly on Substack, Blessed Are the Women, and other good news for all of us. So my question, and I'm realizing as I read yours, it's kind of a hard one, is to tell us something about yourself that is not on the back of your book.
Yeah. Yeah, we fit a lot in there, didn't we?
Yeah, lucky.
So I am from Texas, and even though I've lived in Nashville with my family for many years now, when people ask me where are you from, I always say West Texas because I
Mm,
just can't. I'm like, I live in Nashville, but I'm from West Texas, and that is really important to me. My geography and the land from which I come, and my connection to it. So my dog is here with us in this lovely live chat.
I don't think the dog made it to the back of the book, so that's another
She
good.
didn't. I mean, I love her. I do. And drives me a little nuts, because working from home, we spend a lot of time together.
Right?
So
I love it.
anyway,
Love
she's
it
sweet.
so
But yeah, so her name is Bella. And we've had her for many years now. But yeah, so that's part of, I think that would be one of the things that I would highlight,
where you're from.
and where I'm from, and the land that kind of shaped
Mm,
me and still does shape me. So
mm,
yeah,
love that. I love that. Did you go to high school in West Texas?
I did.
Okay.
Hmm.
I'm just asking that. We gotta get into the book thing. But I had heard that people say where they're from based on where they went to high school if they move a lot. So I don't know. I
Oh,
something that I test around because I definitely would say that too. Like I'm from Chicago suburbs. That's where I went to high school. I mean, that's my whole childhood was there, but I also kind of traveled around as an adult. But where you're from, I don't know, in those formative years, maybe.
yeah.
Well, okay. So we're here to talk about your first of many books, I am sure. Blessed Are the Women. I love this book. So much to say about it. I want to do a little show and tell on it quickly before we just get into some things so that folks know what kind of book it is, right? So it's not a Bible study, it's not a novel, it's a hybrid of all kinds of things. One of the reasons I wanted to interview you, and I have been singing lots of praises of this book, is that I think it does a lot of things for you if you are clergy or even a church member. It's got liturgies, it's got devotionals, it's got little stories and monologues that you can use. It's kind of hard to explain, but it's all of these things together. So you have these ways of getting to know the women of the Bible in an imaginative, creative way. And then you have tools to lift up their stories in your church context. So that's my read on it. Did I do it right? Is that how you would describe it? How are you describing your book when people
You did
ask?
great. Yeah. So when I talked with Beth Allison Barr, she wrote The Making of Biblical Womanhood, for those who don't know, and is a Christian historian at Baylor University. But I got to be in conversation with her in March, and she pointed out, which I hadn't thought about this, she was like, Claire, you've done the sermon prep
Mm,
for preachers, because each chapter is a woman's story with her name, her voice, kind of midrash, right? The story beyond the story that we find in the text. How would she tell her story if we heard it from her and not from kind of a male narrative?
Yeah.
And then there's a corresponding liturgy for personal and communal spiritual practice that,
Mm.
yeah, you can use in your worship service, right? Like the order of worship is there for you. And then questions for reflection to engage your own kind of curiosities and going deeper, but also for communal conversation. And then the contemporary connection, the public witness that is connecting what we are praying and reading from our holy sacred scripture to where we are in our lives today. And so that's a highlight of a woman led nonprofit that's doing the work of love, justice, and mercy right now.
Mm.
And so I loved that she pointed that out because I hadn't fully connected that. I had mostly been thinking about, our
Mm.
communities and those of us who just want to circle up together and center and celebrate women's stories. But I was like, yeah, great.
I love that. That's so true. I
I
mean,
think you're
so
right.
it makes me think you could use it as a sermon series, you could use it as a book study. So I'm just thinking, like, I'm sure you know off the top of your head, like how many chapters are we? So it's 11 chapters all. So yeah, 10,
Well,
right?
it's
Yeah,
10,
10.
it's 10
10 chapters,
chapters
books to epilogue.
within my prologue, interlude, and epilogue are parts of my own story, sort of
Mhm.
interwoven with the
Yeah.
women's stories.
So you could
Yeah.
do, I mean, I think most people do like a 4 to 8 week sermon series. You could easily pick your top favorite
Yep.
ones, and do a great
Yeah.
series on that. That's awesome. Have you been hearing back from people that are doing that yet with sermon
I
series?
haven't specifically. I've mostly heard from folks who are, doing book groups and
Book groups.
clubs or kind of Bible study, for their Sunday school class. But yeah, I mean,
Yeah,
I'd love
like,
to.
let us know if you do it.
That's right. Yeah, I would
I'm
love
super
that.
connected to a lot of women clergy groups, so I'm gonna definitely suggest that because I think we're, especially as we get into the summer, looking for stuff like that.
Hmm.
And then this kind of like fits into a question that I wanted to ask or a conversation I wanted to start around lifting up the stories of women and whose job it is. And I wanted to refer back to just a little chatty conversation we had in general. We were talking about the book, and I said something like, "Oh, I really want to make sure that my daughter has this book in her life." And you kind of gently said, "Yeah, and son, your sons too." And it made me think like, yeah, of course, right? Like, of course. But why do we as women feel like we're the ones that are responsible for lifting up these stories? And what would it be like for the men in our lives, the male pastor colleagues, to do this as a sermon series? And I was just wondering if you had any thoughts on that. Your book's been out for a while. What's the reception been? Has it been mostly women that respond, or do you have some examples of male allies who are just rocking it?
Yeah. Um, yeah, it's so important that I have a son and a
Mhm.
daughter, but that and of course, just a little note here. I'm a firm believer that gender is completely constructed. And so there's I offer, a definition of how I understand woman
Mhm.
in at the very, very beginning. And it's less about um the sort of gendered category and more about the way we live, like the
Mhm.
what we embody, the values we embody and live out in our lives. And so in that sense, like many of us could
Mhm.
identify as women.
Yeah.
The same way I think about mothering, right? It's a way of being in the world, not just tied to a gender. But my
Mhm.
son, who is a socially constructed white little boy,
Mhm.
um, is it's so important to me that he sees that women's stories told by them, right? So I'm not interested in a bunch of men coming in and continuing to tell our stories, right? Like it with their interpretation, because that's what we have in the biblical text is, men's narratives, and then women kind of fit into them, right? What I'm interested in though is like men valuing and centering women, right? And celebrating that, them stories by them, from them, with them. And so, right, like in the kind of cultural zeitgeist right now, women's basketball is a huge, part of the
Mm.
conversation. So I love it when like my son is like, "Is Caitlin Clark playing?
Mhm.
Like, can we go? Can we?" And I'm like, "Heck yeah, man! Like, we're
Yeah.
turning this on. We're watching, women's Final Four just as much as we're watching the men's Final Four. We're big basketball people, and that all happened just now, in March Madness. But and so that's just a lovely example. It's like, and it's like I want our sons to say, "I'm going to a church that has women in leadership."
Yeah.
Like, I want that to be the norm,
Mhm.
right? And I think we get there. One of the ways we get there is by centering and celebrating women's stories over and over and over again.
Mhm.
Um, and our stories being more than just a sermon, but the prayers we pray, the things we talk about, the subject matter, right? When women are at the forefront of that, it shifts,
Yeah. Yeah,
you know?
100%, and you're reminding me of a story. It fits in with what you're saying because it's all about what your perspective is, and I'm, an ordained pastor, not serving a congregation right now, but when my kids were really small, there was a Saturday morning, and I said, "Okay, we're gonna drop these papers off at Pastor Rob's house, and then we're gonna go to the park." And they were like, "Who's Pastor Rob?" And I was like, "Oh, he's a, pastor." And they said, "Boys can be pastors?" And it was because I'm a
Wow.
pastor and my best friends are women, and so in their little
Mm,
worlds, women are the women are the pastors, but it was
mhm.
like, "Oh my gosh," like, and I said to them, "Actually, most of the pastors in the country are boys," and they were like, just mind blown. So what would it
Uh-huh.
mean for us to just kind of have, these stories lifted up, right? So often we hear like the fathers of the faith and like the biblical heroes. And so, but it's just all about what we choose to center and put forward. And that kind of brings me to the season that we're in right now, which is springtime. And you have a chapter on the women of Easter. And I really, really, really resonated with it because this season is my favorite season. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about that chapter in particular and how
Mm,
you see the women.
yeah. Yeah, I think that chapter is called Women's Easter, and, I it's the story from Mary Magdalene, from her with her voice, her name, and it was my very favorite to write.
Oh,
I
yay. I
loved it.
picked the right one.
I was born in April, so I've had many an Easter on or around, my
Mm,
birthday, so I also love, spring and this time, but, you know, my understanding of life and death has evolved,
mhm,
as we would hope, as I've gotten older and as I've had different experiences with both. And it just, at some point along my journey, my spiritual journey, it just no longer resonated with me or made sense that we're like conquering death.
mm,
Um, I, I became curious about what it would mean to befriend it. And
mhm,
this is coming from someone, I mean, death makes me, ugh, like, I don't love it. I don't love the thought of losing the people I love. I don't like the thought of me dying. I mean, that's done a lot of my work in spiritual direction and in
mhm,
therapy. And so we get this story, right? This Easter story that is just life and death, just all right here up with each
mhm,
other. And then for me, becoming a mother and
mhm.
giving birth to two children, and then practicing as a doula and helping bring other, it was like I could no longer like think of life and death as like separate or as against each other.
Mm.
I mean, they're just right up there with each other. They are the best of friends, and you cannot, I mean, it sounds so obvious when I say it, but, like, you cannot
Mhm.
have one without the other.
Mhm.
And so with Easter and with Mary Magdalene, it was, like, so important to me to be honest about that, and then to think about how the first Easter, like, when I mean, there was trauma and grief and shock and terror, um, going on, right? Like, I don't know that it was this, like, let's bring out the brass band. Now,
Mm.
bring out the brass band and go for it, right? Like, I'm not demeaning that. I'm just saying when I'm thinking about that first Easter, the women show up. Mary Magdalene is the first one, right, to
Yeah.
preach the gospel of Jesus is risen. And she's doing so not from this, like, we've conquered everything,
Yeah.
but, like, he's not here. Like, he's not here. And so how do we build from that? And so when I reread that chapter, recently, I also saw that, like, I offer a vision for what church could be. And
Mhm.
I think of it really as women's church. And that
Mm.
doesn't mean that people who identify as men, aren't a part of it, but that it is the women leading us in those first kind of, seeds of
Yeah.
what then grew in, let's help each other heal from
Yeah.
this traumatizing, terrible thing. Let's be honest about our grief. Let's share
Mhm.
in community, and
Yeah.
let's circle up in love and tell our stories. And, like,
Mm.
that was it. And to
Mhm.
me, that is woman led. It is, without the women, we wouldn't have it. And so,
Mm.
I'm trying to, in my own life, just pay attention to the ways that I am a part of those
Mm.
circles,
Yeah.
and helping to, I think, return in
Mhm.
many ways, to something that is ancient and been with us forever,
Yeah.
right? Like, this isn't some, like, new thing, like,
The
um,
church has always been run
so
by women,
yeah,
right? Yeah.
yeah, I mean, and sustained by and loved, right? And cared for, and,
Mm.
um, embodied by, right? That
Mhm.
it's not a place we have to go to, it's something we can live.
Yeah.
And so, gosh, if, I mean, Mary Magdalene has a pretty big, load to bear. I mean, because that's a lot, I mean, we've put so much on her
Yeah.
throughout history. It was also just important to me to, show them that Jesus and Mary Magdalene is really dear friends.
Mhm.
That was just important to me, for so many reasons. And I mean, yeah.
I loved it too, and again, you do, in all of the chapters, there's a part where you, are speaking through the voice of the women, allowing us to kind of have the monologues. So back to the kind of idea of how would a male identified pastor do avoid the pitfall of trying to retell the stories of women, could invite women to read those, and you wouldn't have to have somebody, that feels like they're
Mhm. That's right.
acting. They could just read it. They could just read it, or you could have
Yeah.
people read it, and
Yeah.
it's this I'm not trying to put you on the spot if the answer is no, but I'm curious if you did a study, if you've ever, like, gone through and listed out all of the or a number of the women that don't have names in the Bible and thought about doing a study that way.
Yeah. That's a great idea. I love that idea. I have not
Yeah.
actually done that. And my process has been more,
Mm.
I mean, with this book in particular, I mean, gosh, there's just so many, and you
There's
could
just
just,
layers
but,
on layers, that's the
layers
thing.
on layers on layers. But I started in Luke and then
Yeah.
kind of did a few
Mhm.
outside of that. I've always been drawn to the Gospel of Luke, and
Yeah.
years ago was like, I think Luke was written by a woman. I mean,
Oh,
that's
wow.
I mean, which is like, I know historically Luke was a doctor and all this kind of
Yeah.
stuff, but I'm so interested in, like, I mean, the whole thing of, like, if you see, written by anonymous, well, it was written by a
Mhm.
woman, but, like, we just know now, right, that so
Mhm.
much of what was written or not,
Yeah.
and what got published or not, had to do with this whole, gendered thing,
Yeah.
and that if you were a woman for years, I mean, there was no writing, there was no, publishing, there was no getting your voice out there. So I'm so curious about what our sacred scripture sounds like, feels like,
Yeah.
reads like, from a woman's perspective. And so that's kind of how I started. But I also, I say this kind of early on, but I'm like, all of these women are not, they have names. We
Mhm.
just don't know
We
them
just know what they are.
because nobody wrote them down. So I don't, and you didn't say this, but I've heard
Mhm.
people say like the nameless women. I'm like, no, they have
They
names.
have names, right, they have names.
Mhm.
Well, so this is kind of reminding me of a conversation that I had, with Sandy Sasso. I don't know if you know who she is. She was the
I
first
mean, I have
ordained
her books. Yeah.
okay, yep, she was like the first, uh, ordained rabbi in I
Hmm.
think, I don't know, in all of Judaism. This shows my ignorance of all the different branches of Judaism, but she's the first ordained, and she part of what she's done in her writing is with midrash, and so she
Hmm.
wrote a children's book that is the story of Noah's wife, and there's a midrash about Noah's
Oh.
wife's name. It's for kids, and it's like, so I don't want to get too much into it, but like one of the things that she says in there is that Noah's wife, she takes care of all the seeds, and she like puts them in her dress, and then she like plants a garden, and then this whole thing. And I've used that story for years, and I told this to her that I overheard some kids telling it like as if that's how it was. They were like, "Oh, and Noah's
Uh,
wife is named Naamah, and she blah 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 blah." And so there's a lot of freedom in Jewish
mhm.
tradition to, if the name's not written down, we can just choose it and say what it is. And I think there's a great value in that. I think it's
Yeah.
because then you don't have the nameless women, right? Then you just give them a name, right?
You
Like
name them. And that's,
you
I
can
know.
name
So
all of them, Claire.
I've been teaching this. Well,
Yeah,
and so what that's why I want folk, you can do this yourself. Like, it
yeah.
doesn't have to
Doesn't
be
yeah.
me, right? Like, and that's what I've been teaching. And so I use Jesus's sisters kind of in my present,
Mm,
and I say, I'm like, okay, we're gonna, I kind of talk about the why, and then we get to the how, like, why do we center and celebrate, name
yeah.
and reclaim women? And then I get to the how. And it's been fascinating though, because people are like, well, you've you've already named it. And I'm like, no, 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 I want you to use your
Mhm.
imagination, and your, like, what would you name them? What do
Yes.
they love from your perspective? Do they care about Jesus? Are they annoyed by him? Like,
Yeah.
like, what, give them some nuance and some texture and some complexity, just like
Yes.
us, because they're human beings. And so that's
Mhm.
what I'm inviting. But I think I know we have been so programmed
Mhm.
to, I mean, this whole idea of authority and
Mhm.
hierarchy and all of that comes into play here, of who can, write the stories, who can interpret, who can do that.
Yeah.
But particularly with the biblical text, and if
Mhm.
you're taught, that it is sacred and holy and sort of untouchable, right?
Mhm.
And so at the back, I kind of offer some definitions, and
Yeah.
I write about scripture that I want it to be less fixture and more flame.
Mm.
And I have a rabbi who's Rabbi David, who's my teacher and who I learned this from.
Mhm.
But and I'm so grateful. And I took Hebrew as my foreign language in
Yeah.
college just because I wanted to, and I learned just sort of the greatest thing I learned from that. Oh, here's Sasso's book. I was like, I know I have her right here. See,
Oh, yes. Yeah, there you go,
um,
midrash.
on Midrash. Yeah, I mean, she's incredible,
Yeah.
um, and her definition of it is so helpful. But
Mhm.
definitely one of my teachers. But yeah, but one of the greatest things I learned when I was taking Hebrew was like, oh, this word could mean multiple things.
Yeah. Yep.
And so we're making choices, right, as we're putting together these stories.
Mhm.
Um, and so if we made a different choice, and if a different person was choosing,
Yeah,
we might get a different story. So
absolutely.
yeah.
Yeah, and who's writing it? Who's telling it? You said a few minutes ago, you're speculating like, "Oh, well, what if Luke was written by a woman?" And another thing that I think pastors can do is where things are left unsaid to put a woman's as a placeholder. It's like, why is the male always the default? And I was at a church on Sunday visiting,
Mhm.
and it was, the Good Shepherd Sunday or whatever, and the pastor was read Psalm 23, and then not only did they did they put feminine language in that psalm, like, through a
Was it
song.
Bobby
Bobby
McFerrin's?
McFerrin's, yep,
Oh,
they
I was
did
just
that
about to say
one
it's on that's on the
on your
playlist.
playlist.
Mhm.
Yeah, we gotta talk
Oh
about
my
that in
gosh.
a second. Okay,
Okay.
so
Mhm.
not only did they do that, he also when he was talking about the psalmist, he just dropped in "she." Like, no
Yep.
explanation, not like, "Oh,
Good.
Robert," but he just dropped it in, like, and just said, "The psalmist, when she
Good.
was writing this," and I was like, "Who is this guy?" I don't know, I
Mhm.
was a visitor, so I don't know if he does that regularly or if he had some sort of belief or some knowledge
Mhm.
that the writer of Psalm 23 was a woman, but it was
Mhm.
amazing. Anyway, that's another thing you can do. That's a good I'm glad you said that about the playlist. That's another cool thing you did. Do you link
Uh-huh.
these in
Yeah.
the book? Or how do
Yeah,
people get to the playlist?
there's a QR code in the back for the Blessed Are the Women playlist, and so it links to the Spotify playlist
Oh,
that's
here we
public, and
go.
you can
Right
listen to it.
here.
Mhm. Yep.
See,
Yep.
okay. So when I saw that, I thought maybe you did that like after the fact. I'm so pumped that you did it in
Yeah.
advance. So
Mhm.
you can, when you're doing your little book study slash sermon series, you can have the music playing as people come in.
That's right.
You did
That's right.
everything for us. Did you give us like party planning, colors, what to wear to your book study?
I mean, I could have, but I refrained. I showed a little restraint. There's also in the appendix just a guide for a small group study that kind of gives you a small group guide and sort of, pre-gathering group guidelines, and then what you do when you gather. So yeah, I have, because this is the thing. It's like I didn't want to just offer something and then people not know
Yeah,
like what to do, because I hear that a lot from folks like,
yeah,
well, what am I supposed to do now,
yeah.
I want this to be a resource and a tool
Mhm.
to help us continue the work of centering and celebrating women and our narratives and the beauty and complexity of those. And so yeah, I think, that's a lovely thing to hear from that pastor. I mean, using feminine language for God, I'm like, we could literally only refer to God as she
Yeah.
for like the next, I don't know, millions of years, however many, however long
Yeah.
we um and still not, right, like, come to some
Balance it
kind
out.
of balance for
Yeah.
how long we've heard God as Father or Goddess. Now, and so I think that's just a point that I make. I'm not saying, that, but like I've heard that art, well, we try to balance between
Mhm,
father and mother, and
mhm.
and I'm like, okay, cool. And
I
and
am
there's a
so on
lot
this
to be
train
there's a lot to be
1,000%.
made up for. So
I think
um
for all the pastors watching and listening, just know that anytime you use feminine language for God, number 1, you probably will get pushback, okay? But you will also change somebody's life. I mean, so many stories of women that the first time they heard that, the first time they heard feminine language and felt included, it changed their whole world and
Yeah.
their whole life. And yeah, this I could go on all day. I don't want to be like, but it is a little bit of a soapbox for me. I have a friend who wrote a
Uh-huh.
book called Dear Mama God.
Mm,
And just she tells this story of how again, she was in church and it was one lyric that was changed to a she. And then because that's her book, she's connected with lots of people. And one of our mutual friends, Herb Montgomery, says exactly what you said. Like, you cannot just switch over to the neutral or just refer to God as God's self without taking a stop at the feminine. Like, we've had it this way
mhm,
for 2,000 years. You can't just jump over feminine imagery. And
mhm.
that's a whole other. I'm sorry that I don't remember, but do you address that in this book, like feminine language for God?
I don't think I do
Yeah, okay.
directly. I mean, I think it's implicit,
Yeah,
but I think for me, it's just a no-brainer.
yeah, right?
Like like God is this is blessed are the women.
Mhm.
We if I'm writing the stories and thinking about the liturgies from the women,
Yeah.
they know God as the one who births, right? And
Mhm.
so if we and that was kind of in the introduction, I think it's like God the deliverer. I mean,
Yes.
we are delivering. We are
Yes,
giving birth. God is giving birth to
yes.
this world, to the kingdom, right? And so I mean that right there. I mean, and I'm like and so that's I'm like Jesus, our deliverer,
Yes.
Christ. I mean, if we're thinking, our deliverer had to first be delivered
Yep. Amen. I
by a
mean, yeah, the
woman
whole
named
mother of
Mary.
God thing. I mean, we have to also I feel like it's required to make reference to Will Gaffney's, The Women's Lectionary. And all of the
Yes.
work that she has done in translation,
Yeah.
around all of this and just helping kind of what you're saying 10 minutes ago about the Hebrew, just pointing out like, "Hello, guys, this is another way that this could be translated." And I don't know, I think about your bio that we read at the beginning and the connections between being a doula and a biblical scholar and a writer and a spiritual director. And to me, it's very
I'm
obvious
not
that
a
all
I'm not a biblical scholar.
yes, you
I'm not
are.
a no, I'm not. That is not a title in there. But anyway, sorry. I'm like,
I
no, 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 no.
reject that title, Smith. I mean, okay, I would push back on it because you went to seminary, you researched this book, you studied Hebrew. You would want the women that are studying this book to consider themselves biblical scholars if they study the Bible. But
Okay,
I hear what you're saying.
okay.
Okay, like, I also don't think we should, like, claim to have fake degrees. I didn't say you had a PhD in it,
No,
in
I know. I'm
both.
like, I am not a
But, like,
biblical scholar.
all of these different threads that kind of went into writing this, I really see them. I see them all together and, informing the book. So, okay, can you tell us now I'm gonna mess up the name even, who Mary's mother was? And tell us about I know it's not in the
Yeah.
book, but
Yeah,
I
yeah,
love
yeah.
and you told me about it, so
So she is Saint Anne. So in the Gospel of Thomas, hold on, where's my
I love
I
how
thought
you
I
have all
had
your books, like, right around the
I do, and behind me, I just can't keep it. I know, I'm like, listen, there. I'm looking at like a windowsill, and so I keep like kind of the most pressing ones or the most important ones that I reference often there. But anyway, there's a gospel written about Anne and Joachim, who were Mary's parents,
Hmm.
and and it's not clearly in our canon, but she in the Catholic tradition, Saint Anne was sainted, and she is understood as the mother of all mothers because she birthed Mary. And the narrative that we get is, of course, all about protecting Mary's purity,
Hmm.
which is has some things that I would, if I was writing that that story, I would
And
question
you
a little bit.
shall, Claire.
And I hope that, yeah, I get to. And thinking about her as a saint, I mean, there's this small little town in Italy, like southern Italy, and I can't think of the name of it, but I was telling you, that they have a whole celebration on her feast day and march through the streets, like holding up her picture and celebrating mothers and the mothering spirit. And oh gosh, when I heard that, and I was like, oh my gosh, I need to know more about
Yeah,
Anne
me
or
too. When you
Santa Anna. I mean, they, how she's referenced, but
Hmm.
so yeah, she, the story goes that when Mary was very young, she knew that she was set apart and holy, and so she sent her basically to live in the temple, or like, I mean, kind of what we would understand as like a monastery or something, but clearly they're Jewish. But um, and then Anne is the one who is kind of the primary one finding Joseph for Mary, so that again her purity is intact, so that she can give birth to Jesus. And I just, yeah, I considered writing her for this one because I thought, and then it was like I had, anyway, that one needed to kind of, I was like, she will show up in another place, in her time. But
Yeah,
um, I'm so interested in what mothers do
yeah.
as a mother myself, but for our children. And I think I can't read that story and not go, man, she went to some places
Yeah.
to to protect her daughter. And honestly, she might have even, I think the narrative might even say that she gave Mary up, I mean, as an infant. I need to
Mm.
go check all that. Okay, y'all, we're gonna like in the comments or something, like give some facts here, because I
Well, I
promise
mean
I'm not making this up. But anyway,
well, I wanna read it. I mean, I think
yeah.
it's such a
Mm,
reminder of all the extra canonical stuff that's out
yeah,
there, and some of the stuff that didn't make it into our canon, you're like, "Oh, you can see why they're like, oh, they bounced that, it doesn't really fit." But then there's other things, like this one that makes me wonder, like, "Well, what was it about this that made us
right.
say that it doesn't belong?" And, like, I just found myself tearing up when you said that she's the mother of mothers, right? Like, that's just, like,
Mhm.
pretty profound. And then it also reminds me, I was thinking of the one Anne that I know who is a very important, counselor and spiritual director in my life and a Catholic sister. So not a mother herself, but she is a mother of she is has a very mothering spirit. So I think
Yeah.
as we're coming up, at least on the time that we're recording this, Mother's Day is coming up. And
Mhm.
I do think that there has been a real disservice done in churches on Mother's Day, in terms of, like, conflating womanhood and motherhood into this ideal and this
Yeah.
thing. And as I'm talking, I'm like, "Oh, this is another way we could use this book on Mother's Day to lift up different women and different women's struggles." Can I'm sorry I'm lobbing, like, really hard questions at you. I did not preview. I did not tell you I was gonna be like, "So can you please talk about the struggle of infertility?" But, like, um,
Mm,
but what would you say about all that for Mother's
yeah.
Day and all of the fraughtness in the church? I think it's really important to talk about.
Well, first of all, Mother's Day started as a peace movement,
Mhm.
okay? During the Civil War, because mothers were like, "Can our children please stop killing each other?
Yeah.
Can our sons stop killing each other, please?" And so
Mm,
that's how it started. So I think knowing I mean, here in the United States, right?
yeah.
And so then, of course, I mean, there's just so much we can get into on the
Mhm.
conflation of
Yeah.
government and church and
Yeah.
separation and not and all of that. But and like why, I mean, it's not, I mean, Mother's Day, it's not a
It's not a religious
liturgical,
holiday, right? Yeah.
it's not in our, but here we are. And yeah, like you can't read our sacred texts and not again see mothers everywhere,
Mhm.
including a mothering God. And so, and as someone, I mean, yes, I write openly about, you know, experiencing what Western doctors called infertility. That word just never resonated with me or felt like it fit. I never felt infertile.
Mm.
And I touch on this in Elizabeth's story, like, how can I be infertile when I have an open heart and
Mhm.
when I am caring for, I've been a mother, that line with Elizabeth is, I was a mother before I was a mother.
Mhm.
And so it's this idea that like mothering is an act, it's a way of being. We
Yeah.
live this, as I kind of touched on earlier. And so I think we would do uh, service and justice
Mhm.
to our matron saints, and the mothers, our matriarchs, by sort of honoring that it is a way of being. And I, again, knowing the origins of Mother's Day, believe the way of being is rooted in peace and justice and working toward that. And so, what does it look like to talk about, you know, the moms? And I'm not saying all of them are actually birth mothers, but who have stood at I'm here in
Mhm.
Tennessee, but in the Tennessee legislature day in and day out for the past week, really 2 weeks, advocating for gun safety
Mhm.
for our kids. I mean, that is mothering, right? And so often is embodied by people who identify as women, but also can be embodied and lived by those who identify in all many and beautiful ways. And so, yeah, that's what I have to say about that.
I mean, that's gonna have to be where we have to end because we cannot top that. That's so, 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 so
Mm,
good, Claire. Thank you so
mm.
much. Last little PS for people. Where can people find out besides like I gotta do my Chalice thing. Besides purchasing Blessed Are the Women on chalicepress.com, where
That's right.
else where else can people connect with you, learn more about you and your work and all of this amazingness?
Yeah. So I am on Substack, as my bio says, and I do write weekly there,
Mm,
for the public, and then also have some, paid subscription options. But it is free. My weekly comes out on Sunday mornings.
mm.
Blessed are the women, and other good news for all of us, because women are in our blessedness is really good news, and there's lots of others that uh, comes from that. So, um, and then I'm on Instagram, Claire McKeever Burgett, and then my website, ClaireMcKeeverBurgett.com. Just kind of all runs together in that beautiful name. Beautifully, beautiful,
You're the
long
only
mouthful of
one,
a name.
unlike Tracy Smith, of which there are
That's
legion.
right. I don't know any other Claire McKeever Burgett's out there. So, so yeah, I love to connect, and yeah, I just want folks to hang out with the book and the content within it, and
Yeah.
yeah, share it with
Well,
their communities.
you are a delight. I knew this conversation was gonna be fun and winding. I didn't know how winding, but I'm so glad and grateful, and, just thank you again so much for your generosity and your beautiful
Thank
book and
you.
work in the world. Good to see you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye, y'all.